What's up, folks? I'm Dan, and welcome to I've Been Meaning to Read That, the show where I read books out loud that I've been meaning to read. Let's go. Y'all, I am so sorry. I have not recorded in a while, and you know what? I've just got some updates for you. So first off, and not to toot my own horn, my wife and I bought a house last week. We're pretty stoked, and if you've ever bought a house, you know that there are a lot of meetings with a lot of people and a lot of paperwork. There's the inspections, signing everything at the title agency, talking to the realtors, and then there's all the going back and forth between you and the sellers. It's crazy. But we did the darn thing, and now we have a house. And then we had to meet with a bunch of contractors so that they could fix the house, so that we could move into the house. And then last week, we had a fundraiser for the foundation that my family runs for mental health awareness and suicide prevention. And folks, if you are going through some dark times and thinking some bad things, just know that there's hope and that at the very least, I'm here for you. You can always reach out to me anytime. Also, if that's not something you're comfortable with, the suicide prevention hotline is 988. Give that a call 24 hours a day. No big deal. So yeah, it's just been a very busy time. Oh, and I almost forgot. The weather's changing and it is nice outside. And I get home from work right around 4 when it is extra beautiful and all I feel like doing is going outside. But I'm here and I'm ready to go. Let's get to it, people. I am especially excited because we've just found out that Valentine has just found out that her own stepmother is trying to kill her and that the Count is trying to rescue her. Stuff is getting interesting. Alright, let's get to Chapter 102. Chapter 102, Valentine. The nightlight continued to burn on the chimney-piece, exhausting the last drops of oil which floated on the surface of the water. The globe of the lamp appeared of a reddish hue, and the flame, brightening before it expired, threw out the last flickerings which in an inanimate object had been so often compared with the convulsions of a human creature in its final agonies. A dull and dismal light was shed over the bedclothes and curtains surrounding the young girl. All noise in the streets had ceased, and the silence was frightful. It was then that the door of Edward's room opened, and a head we have before noticed appeared in the glass opposite. It was Madame de Villefort, who came to witness the effects of the drink she had prepared. She stopped in the doorway, listened for a moment to the flickering of the lamp, the only sound in that deserted room, and then advanced to the table to see if Valentine's glass were empty. It was still about a quarter full, as we before stated. Madame de Villefort emptied the contents into the ashes, which she disturbed that they might the more readily absorb the liquid. Then she carefully rinsed the glass, and wiping it with her handkerchief, replaced it on the table. If anyone could have looked into the room just then, he would have noticed the hesitation with which Madame de Villefort approached the bed and looked fixedly on Valentine. The dim light, the profound silence, and the gloomy thoughts inspired by the hour, and still more by her own conscience, all combined to produce a sensation of fear. The poisoner was terrified at the contemplation of her own work. At length she rallied, drew aside the curtain, and leaning over the pillow, gazed intently on Valentine. The young girl no longer breathed. No breath issued through the half-closed teeth. The white lips no longer quivered. The eyes were suffused with a bluish vapor, and the long, black lashes rested on a cheek white as wax. Madame de Villefort gazed upon the face, so expressive even in its stillness. Then she ventured to raise the coverlet and press her hand upon the young girl's heart. It was cold and motionless. She only felt the pulsation in her own fingers, and withdrew her hand with a shudder. One arm was hanging out of the bed. From shoulder to elbow it was molded after the arms of Germaine Pillon's Graces, but the forearm seemed to be slightly distorted by convulsion, and the hand, so delicately formed, was resting with stiff, outstretched fingers on the framework of the bed. The nails, too, were turning blue. Madame de Villefort had no longer any doubt. All was over. She had consummated the last terrible work she had to accomplish. There was no more to do in the room, so the poisoner retired stealthily, as though fearing to hear the sound of her own footsteps. But as she withdrew, she still held aside the curtain, absorbed in the irresistible attraction always exerted by the picture of death, so long as it is merely mysterious and does not excite disgust. The minutes passed. Madame de Villefort could not drop the curtain which she held like a funeral pall over the head of Valentine. She was lost in reverie, and the reverie of crime is remorse. Just then, the lamp again flickered. The noise startled Madame de Villefort, who shuddered and dropped the curtain. Immediately afterwards, the light expired, and the room was plunged in frightful obscurity, while the clock at that minute struck 4:30. Overpowered with agitation, the poisoner succeeded in groping her way to the door, and reached her room in an agony of fear. The darkness lasted 2 hours longer. Then, by degrees, a cold light crept through the Venetian blinds, until at length it revealed the objects in the room. About this time, the nurse's cough was heard on the stairs, and the woman entered the room with a cup in her hand. To the tender eye of a father or a lover, the first glance would have sufficed to reveal Valentine's condition, but to this hireling, Valentine only appeared to be asleep. "Good," she exclaimed, approaching the table. "She's taken part of her draught. The glass is 3/4 empty." Then she went to the fireplace and lit the fire, and although she had just left her bed, she could not resist the temptation offered by Valentine's sleep, so she threw herself into an armchair to snatch a little more rest. The clock striking 8 awoke her. Astonished at the prolonged slumber of the patient, and frightened to see that the arm was still hanging out of the bed, she advanced towards Valentine, and for the first time noticed the white lips. She tried to replace the arm, but it moved with a frightful rigidity which could not deceive a sick nurse. She screamed aloud, then, running to the door, exclaimed, "Help! Help!" "What is the matter?" asked Monsieur d'Avrigny at the foot of the stairs, it being the hour he usually visited her. "What is it?" asked Villefort, rushing from his room. "Doctor, do you hear them call for help?" Yes, let us hasten up. It was in Valentine's room." But before the doctor and the father could reach the room, the servants who were on the same floor had entered, and seeing Valentine pale and motionless on her bed, they lifted up their hands towards heaven and stood transfixed, as though struck by lightning. "Call Madame de Villefort. Wake her! Wake her!" cried the procureur from the door of his chamber, which apparently he scarcely dared to leave. But instead of obeying him, the servant stood watching Monsieur d'Avrigny, who ran to Valentine and raised her in his arms. "What? This one too?" he said. "Oh, where will be the end?" Villefort rushed into the room. "What are you saying, doctor?" he exclaimed, raising his hands to heaven. "I say that Valentine is dead," replied d'Avrigny, in a voice terrible in its solemn calmness. Monsieur de Villefort staggered and buried his head in the bed. On the exclamation of the doctor and the cry of the father, the servants all fled with muttered imprecations. They were heard running down the stairs and through the long passages. Then there was a rush in the court. Afterwards, all was still. They had, one and all, deserted the accursed house. Just then, Madame de Villefort, in the act of slipping on her dressing gown, threw aside the drapery and for a moment stood motionless, as though interrogating the occupants of the room, while she endeavored to call up some rebellious tears. On a sudden, she stepped, or rather bounded, with outstretched arms towards the table. She saw d'Avrigny curiously examining the glass, which she felt certain of having emptied during the night. It was now a third full, just as it was when she threw the contents into the ashes. The spectre of Valentine rising before the poisoner would have alarmed her less. It was, indeed, the same color as the draught she had poured into the glass, and which Valentine had drunk. It was indeed the poison, which could not deceive Monsieur d'Avrigny, which he now examined so closely. It was doubtless a miracle from heaven that, notwithstanding her precautions, there should be some trace, some proof, remaining to reveal the crime. While Madame de Villefort remained rooted to the spot like a statue of terror, and Villefort, with his head hidden in the bedclothes, saw nothing around him, d'Avrigny approached the window that he might the better examine the contents of the glass, and dipping the tip of his finger in, he tasted it. "Ah," he exclaimed, "it is no longer brucine that is used. Let me see what it is." Then he ran to one of the cupboards in Valentine's room, which had been transformed into a medicine closet, and taking from its silver case a small bottle of nitric acid, he dropped a little of it into the liquor, which immediately changed to a blood-red color. "Ah, exclaimed d'Avrigny in a voice in which the horror of a judge unveiling the truth was mingled with the delight of a student making a discovery. Madame de Villefort was overpowered. Her eyes first flashed and then swam. She staggered towards the door and disappeared. Directly afterwards, the distant sound of a heavy weight falling onto the ground was heard, but no one paid any attention to it. The nurse was engaged in watching the chemical analysis, and Villefort was still absorbed in grief. Monsieur d'Avrigny alone had followed Madame de Villefort with his eyes and watched her hurried retreat. He lifted up the drapery over the entrance to Edward's room, and his eyes reaching as far as Madame de Villefort's apartment, he beheld her, extended, lifeless, on the floor. "Go to the assistance of Madame de Villefort," he said to the nurse. "Madame de Villefort is ill." "But Mademoiselle de Villefort," stammered the nurse. "Mademoiselle de Villefort no longer requires help," said d'Avrigny, "since she is dead." "Dead. Dead," groaned forth Villefort in a paroxysm of grief, which was the more terrible from the novelty of the sensation in the iron heart of that man. "Dead?" repeated a third voice. "Who said Valentine was dead?" The two men turned round and saw Morel standing at the door, pale and terror-stricken. This is what had happened. At the usual time, Morel had presented himself at the little door leading to Noirtier's room. Contrary to custom, the door was open, and having no occasion to ring, he entered. He waited for a moment in the hall and called for a servant to conduct him to Monsieur Noirtier, but no one answered, the servants having, as we know, deserted the house. Morel had no particular reason for uneasiness. Monte Cristo had promised him that Valentine should live, and so far he had always fulfilled his word. Every night, the Count had given him news, which was the next morning confirmed by Noirtier. Still, this extraordinary silence appeared strange to him, and he called a second and third time. Still no answer. Then he determined to go up. Noirtier's room was open like all the rest. The first thing he saw was the old man sitting in his armchair in his usual place, but his eyes expressed alarm, which was confirmed by the pallor which overspread his features. "How are you, sir?" asked Morel with a sickness of heart. "Well," answered the old man by closing his eyes, but his appearance manifested increasing uneasiness. "You are thoughtful, sir," continued Morel. "You want something. Shall I call one of the servants?" "Yes," replied Noirtier. Morel pulled the bell, but though he nearly broke the cord, no one answered. He turned towards Noirtier. The pallor and anguish expressed on his countenance momentarily increased. "Why do they not come? Is anyone ill in the house?" exclaimed Morel. The eyes of Noirtier seemed as though they would start from their sockets. "What's the matter? You alarm me." "Valentine? Is it Valentine?" "Yes, yes," signed Noirtier. Maximilian tried to speak, but he could articulate nothing. He staggered and supported himself against the wainscot. Then he pointed to the door. "Yes, yes, yes," continued the old man. Maximilian rushed up the little staircase, while Noirtier's eyes seemed to say, "Quicker, quicker." In a minute, the young man darted through several rooms, till at length he reached Valentine's. There was no occasion to push the door, and was wide open. A sob was the only sound he heard. He saw, as though in a mist, a black figure kneeling and buried in a confused mass of white drapery. A terrible fear transfixed him. It was then he heard a voice exclaim that Valentine was dead, and another voice which, like an echo, repeated that final word. Dead. Dead. End of chapter 102. Chapter 103. Maximilian. Villefort rose, half ashamed of being surprised in such a paroxysm of grief. The terrible office he had held for 25 years had succeeded in making him more or less than man. His glance, at first wandering, fixed itself upon Morel. "Who are you, sir," he asked, "that forget that this is not the manner to enter a house stricken with death? Go, sir, go." But Morel remained motionless. He could not detach his eyes from that disordered bed, and the pale corpse of the young girl who was lying on it. "Go. Do you hear?" said Villefort, while d'Avrigny advanced to lead Morel out. Maximilian stared for a moment at the corpse, gazed all around the room, then upon the two men. He opened his mouth to speak, but Finding it impossible to give utterance to the innumerable ideas that occupied his brain, he went out, thrusting his hands through his hair in such a manner that Villefort and d'Avrigny, for a moment diverted from the engrossing topic, exchanged glances which seemed to say, "He's mad." But in less than 5 minutes the staircase groaned beneath an extraordinary weight. Morrel was seen carrying, with superhuman strength, the armchair containing Noirtier upstairs. When he reached the landing, he placed the armchair on the floor and rapidly rolled it into Valentine's room. This could only have been accomplished by means of unnatural strength supplied by powerful excitement. But the most fearful spectacle was Noirtier being pushed towards the bed, his face expressing all his meaning, and his eyes supplying the want of every other faculty. That pale face and flaming glance appeared to Villefort like a frightful apparition. Each time he had been brought into contact with his father, something terrible had happened. "See what they have done?" cried Morrel, with one hand leaning on the back of the chair and the other extended towards Valentine. "See, my father, see!" Villefort drew back and looked with astonishment on the young man, who, almost a stranger to him, called Noirtier his father. At this moment, the whole soul of the old man seemed centered in his eyes, which had become bloodshot. The veins of the throat swelled, his cheeks and temples became purple, as though he was struck with epilepsy. Nothing was wanting to complete this but the utterance of a cry, and the cry issued from his pores, if we may thus speak, a cry frightful in its silence. d'Avrigny rushed towards the old man and made him inhale a powerful restorative. "Sir," cried Morrel, seizing the moist hand of the paralytic, "they ask me who I am and what right I have to be here. Oh, you know it. Tell them, tell them." And the young man's voice was choked by sobs. As for the old man, his chest heaved with his panting respiration. One could have thought that he was undergoing the agonies preceding death. At length, happier than the young man, who sobbed without weeping, tears glistened in the eyes of Noirtier. "Tell them," said Morrel in a hoarse voice, "tell them that I am her betrothed. Tell them she was my beloved, my noble girl, my only blessing in the world. Tell them that corpse belongs to me." The young man, overwhelmed by the weight of his anguish, he fell heavily on his knees before the bed, which his fingers grasped with convulsive energy. d'Avrigny, unable to bear the sight of this touching emotion, turned away, and Villefort, without seeking any further explanation, and attracted towards him by the irresistible magnetism which draws us towards those who have loved the people for whom we mourn, extended his hand towards the young man. But Morrel saw nothing. He had grasped the hand of Valentine, and, unable to weep, vented his agony in groans as he bit the sheets. For some time, nothing was heard in that chamber but sobs, exclamations, and prayers. At length, Villefort, the most composed of all, spoke. "Sir," said he to Maximilian, "you say you loved Valentine, that you were betrothed to her. I knew nothing of this engagement, of this love, yet I, her father, forgive you, for I see that your grief is real and deep, and besides my own sorrow is too great for anger to find a place in my heart. But you see that the angel whom you hoped for has left this earth. She has nothing more to do with the adoration of men. Take a last farewell, sir, of her sad remains. Take the hand you expected to possess once more within your own, and then separate yourself from her forever. Valentine now requires only the ministrations of the priest." "You are mistaken, sir," exclaimed Morrel, raising himself on one knee, his heart pierced by a more acute pang than any he had yet felt. "You are mistaken. Valentine, dying as she has, not only requires a priest, but an avenger. You, Monsieur de Villefort, send for the priest. I will be the avenger." "What do you mean, sir?" asked Villefort, trembling at the new idea inspired by the delirium of Morrel. "I tell you, sir, that two persons exist in you. The father has mourned sufficiently. Now let the procureur fulfill his office." The eyes of Noirtier glistened, and d'Avrigny approached. "Gentlemen," said Morrel, reading all that passed through the minds of the witnesses to the scene, "I know what I am saying, and you know as well as I do what I am about to say. Valentine has been assassinated." Villefort hung his head. d'Avrigny approached nearer, and Noirtier said yes with his eyes. Now, sir, continued Morel, in these days no one can disappear by violent means without some inquiries being made as to the cause of her disappearance, even were she not a young, beautiful, and adorable creature like Valentine. Now, Monsieur le Procureur de Roy, asked Morel with increasing vehemence, no mercy is allowed. I denounce the crime. It is your place to seek the assassin. The young man's implacable eyes interrogated Villefort, who, on his side, glanced from Noirtier to d'Avrigny. But instead of finding sympathy in the eyes of the doctor and his father, he only saw an expression as inflexible as that of Maximilian. Yes, indicated the old man. Assuredly, said d'Avrigny. Sir, said Villefort, striving to struggle against this triple force and his own emotion. Sir, you are deceived. No one commits crimes here. I am stricken by fate. It is horrible, indeed, but no one assassinates. The eyes of Noirtier lit up with rage, and d'Avrigny prepared to speak. Morel, however, extended his arm and commanded silence. And I say that murders are committed here, said Morel, whose voice, though lower in tone, lost none of its terrible distinctness. I tell you that this is the fourth victim within the last 4 months. I tell you Valentine's life was attempted by poison 4 days ago, though she escaped, owing to the precautions of Monsieur Noirtier. I tell you that the dose has been double, the poison changed, and that this time it has succeeded. I tell you that you know these things as well as I do, since this gentleman has forewarned you, both as a doctor and as a friend. Oh, you rave, sir, exclaimed Villefort, in vain endeavoring to escape the net in which he was taken. I rave? Said Morel. Well, then, I appeal to Monsieur d'Avrigny himself. Ask him, sir, if he recollects the words he uttered in the garden of this house on the night of Madame de Saint-Méran's death. You thought yourselves alone, and talked about that tragic death, and the fatality you mentioned then is the same which has caused the murder of Valentine. Villefort and d'Avrigny exchanged looks. Yes, yes, continued Morel. Recall the scene, for the words you thought were only given to silence and solitude fell into my ears. Certainly, after witnessing the culpable indolence manifested by Monsieur de Villefort towards his own relations, I ought to have denounced him to the authorities. Then I should not have been an accomplice to thy death, as I now am. Sweet, beloved Valentine, but the accomplice shall become the avenger. This fourth murder is apparent to all, and if thy father abandoned thee, Valentine, it is I, and I swear it, that shall pursue the assassin. And this time, as though nature had at least taken compassion on the vigorous frame, nearly bursting with its own strength, the words of Morel were stifled in his throat. His breast heaved. The tears, so long rebellious, gushed from his eyes, and he threw himself weeping on his knees by the side of the bed. Then d'Avrigny spoke. And I, too, he exclaimed in a low voice, I unite with Monsieur Morel in demanding justice for crime. My blood boils at the idea of having encouraged a murderer by my cowardly concession. Merciful heavens, murmured Villefort. Morel raised his head, and, reading the eyes of the old man, which gleamed with unnatural luster, Stay, he said. Monsieur Noirtier wishes to speak. Yes, indicated Noirtier, with an expression the more terrible from all his faculties being centered in his glance. Do you know the assassin? Asked Morel. Yes, replied Noirtier. And will you direct us? Exclaimed the young man. Listen, Monsieur d'Avrigny, listen. Noirtier looked upon Morel with one of those melancholy smiles which had so often made Valentine happy, and thus fixed his attention. Then, having riveted the eyes of his interlocutor on his own, he glanced towards the door. Do you wish me to leave? Said Morel sadly. Yes, replied Noirtier. Alas, sir, have pity on me. The old man's eyes remained fixed on the door. May I at least return? Asked Morel. Yes. Must I leave alone? No. Whom am I to take with me? The procureur? No. The doctor? Yes. You wish to remain alone with Monsieur de Villefort? Yes. But can he understand you? Yes. Oh, said Villefort, inexpressibly delighted to think that the inquiries were to be made by him alone. Oh, be satisfied. I can understand my father. While uttering these words with this expression of joy, his teeth clashed together violently. d'Avrigny took the young man's arm and led him out of the room. A more than death-like silence then reigned in the house. At the end of a quarter of an hour, a faltering footstep was heard, and Villefort appeared at the door of the apartment where d'Avrigny and Morrel had been staying, one absorbed in meditation, the other in grief. You can come, he said, and led them back to Noirtier. Morrel looked attentively on Villefort. His face was livid, large drops rolled down his face, and in his fingers he held the fragments of a quill pen which he had torn to atoms. Gentlemen, he said, give me your word of honor that this horrible secret shall forever remain buried amongst yourselves. The two men drew back. I entreat you, continued Villefort. But, said Morrel, the culprit, the murderer, the assassin. Do not alarm yourself, sir. Justice will be done, said Villefort. My father has revealed the culprit's name. My father thirsts for revenge as much as you do, yet even he conjures you as I do to keep this secret. Do you not, father? Yes, resolutely replied Noirtier. Morrel suffered an exclamation of horror and surprise to escape him. Sir, said Villefort, arresting Maximilien by the arm, if my father, the inflexible man, makes this request, it is because he knows, be assured, that Valentine will be terribly revenged. Is it not so, father? The old man made a sign in the affirmative. Villefort continued. He knows me, and I have pledged my word to him. Rest assured, gentlemen, that within 3 days, in a less time than justice would demand, the revenge I shall have taken for the murder of my child will be such as to make the boldest heart tremble. And as he spoke these words, he ground his teeth and grasped the old man's senseless hand. Will this promise be fulfilled, Monsieur Noirtier? Asked Morrel, while d'Avrigny looked inquiringly. Yes, replied Noirtier, with an expression of sinister joy. Swear, then, said Villefort, joining the hands of Morrel and d'Avrigny. Swear that you will spare the honor of my house and leave me to avenge my child. D'Avrigny turned round and uttered a very feeble yes, but Morrel, disengaging his hand, rushed to the bed, and after having pressed the cold lips of Valentine with his own, hurriedly left, uttering a long, deep groan of despair and anguish. We have before stated that all the servants had fled. Monsieur de Villefort was therefore obliged to request Monsieur d'Avrigny to superintend all the arrangements consequent upon a death in a large city, more especially a death under such suspicious circumstances. It was something terrible to witness the silent agony, the mute despair of Noirtier, whose tears silently rolled down his cheeks. Villefort retired to his study, and d'Avrigny left to summon the doctor of the mayoralty, whose office it is to examine bodies after decease, and who is expressly named the doctor of the dead. Monsieur Noirtier could not be persuaded to quit his grandchild. At the end of a quarter of an hour, Monsieur d'Avrigny returned with his associate. They found the outer gate closed, and not a servant remaining in the house. Villefort himself was obliged to open to them. But he stopped on the landing. He had not the courage to again visit the death chamber. The two doctors, therefore, entered the room alone. Noirtier was near the bed, pale, motionless, and silent as the corpse. The district doctor approached with the indifference of a man accustomed to spend half his time amongst the dead. He then lifted the sheet, which was placed over the face, and just unclosed the lips. Alas, said d'Avrigny, she is indeed dead, poor child. Yes, answered the doctor laconically, dropping the sheet he had raised. Noirtier uttered a kind of hoarse, rattling sound. The old man's eyes sparkled, and the good doctor understood that he wished to behold his child. He therefore approached the bed, and while his companion was dipping the fingers with which he had touched the lips of the corpse in chloride of lime, he uncovered the calm and pale face, which looked like that of a sleeping angel. A tear, which appeared in the old man's eye, expressed his thanks to the doctor. The doctor of the dead then laid his permit on the corner of the table, and having fulfilled his duty, was conducted out by d'Avrigny. Villefort met them at the door of his study. Having in a few words thanked the district doctor, he returned to d'Avrigny and said, "And now the priest." "Is there any particular priest you wish to pray with, Valentine?" asked d'Avrigny. "No," said Villefort. "Fetch the nearest." "The nearest," said the district doctor, "is a good Italian abbé who lives next door to you. Shall I call on him as I pass?" "D'Avrigny," said Villefort, "be so kind, I beseech you, as to accompany this gentleman. Here is the key of the door, so that you can go in and out as you please. You will bring the priest with you, and will oblige me by introducing him into my child's room." "Do you wish to see him?" "I only wish to be alone. You will excuse me, will you not? A priest can understand a father's grief." And Monsieur de Villefort, giving the key to d'Avrigny, again bade farewell to the strange doctor, and retired to his study, where he began to work. For some temperaments, work is a remedy for all afflictions. As the doctors entered the street, they saw a man in a cassock standing on the threshold of the next door. "This is the abbé of whom I spoke," said the doctor to d'Avrigny. D'Avrigny accosted the priest. "Sir," he said, "are you disposed to confer a great obligation on an unhappy father who has just lost his daughter? I mean Monsieur de Villefort, the king's attorney." "Ah," said the priest, in a marked Italian accent. "Yes, I have heard that death is in that house." "Then I need not tell you what kind of service he requires of you." "I was about to offer myself, sir," said the priest. "It is our mission to forestall our duties." "It is a young girl." "I know it, sir. The servants who have fled from the house informed me. I also know that her name is Valentine, and I have already prayed for her." "Thank you, sir," said d'Avrigny. "Since you have commenced your sacred office, deign to continue it. Come and watch by the dead, and all the wretched family will be grateful to you." "I am going, sir, and I do not hesitate to say that no prayers will be more fervent than mine." D'Avrigny took the priest's hand, and without meeting Villefort, who was engaged in his study, they reached Valentine's room, which on the following night was to be occupied by the undertakers. On entering the room, Noirtier's eyes met those of the abbé, and no doubt he read some particular expression in them, for he remained in the room. D'Avrigny recommended the attention of the priest to the living as well as to the dead, and the abbé promised to devote his prayers to Valentine and his attentions to Noirtier. In order, doubtless, that he might not be disturbed while fulfilling his sacred mission, the priest rose as soon as d'Avrigny departed, and not only bolted the door through which the doctor had just left, but also that leading to Madame de Villefort's room. End of chapter 103.
And cut. That's a wrap, folks. Thanks for listening to today's episode of I've Been Meaning to Read That, with me, your host, Dan. If you want to learn more about the show, you can follow us on Instagram at Meaning to Read and TikTok at I've Been Meaning. If you want to support the show to help keep it going, you can find me on Venmo at Dingus Donut, DINGUSDONUT. Supporters get a shout out on the show, and even more important, get to vote on the next book that we read. No matter what, I'll see you for our next episode. Until then, read those books you've been meaning to read, and have a lovely, lovely day.